Soon the whites would come, of course, but what he was seeing was a moment between, not the plains as they had been or as they would be, but a moment of true emptiness, with thousands of miles of grass resting unused, occupied only by remnants of the buffalo, the Indians, the hunters. Augustus thought they were crazed remnants, mostly, like the old mountain man who worked night and day gathering bones to no purpose. Hi everyone, welcome back to Literary Canon. Today I'm going to be discussing Larry McMurtry's Lonesome Dove. Seems like everyone read this during the month of June. I finished it a little bit later in July, but it's done now. This edition, pretty massive, almost, about 850 pages. I know some people's editions are longer, more in the 900 page length. But Lonesome Dove, Larry McMurtry. This is a Western. It is probably one of the most famous Western novels, along with Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, which I want to discuss kind of later in tandem with Lonesome Dove, because there's an interesting connection that these two share other than both being a Western. And before we really get into discussing the book, I kind of wanted to talk about what is a Western novel, an American Western novel, because really the Western genre was born in America. And I think it is, unlike other genres like fantasy and sci-fi and romance, it is uniquely American. So of course, when European white settlers arrived to America, we continue to push westward and westward and westward. Westward expansion was kind of the predominant theme of the first couple centuries of European American history. And as these settlers are pushing westward, of course, they meet resistance primarily from the Native Americans. So we have the Indian Wars, and we're continuing to push out into the territories, especially once the American Civil War concludes. The areas west of the Mississippi River really become open for settlement from these white settlers. So we continue to push westward, and you have the U.S. cavalry and the Texas Rangers and different militia groups going there, clearing out the areas of Native Americans, meeting that Native American resistance and fighting them in these brutal conflicts that last a long time, and kind of what they would say taming the land. And finally, by the end of the 1800s, the early 1900s, the West was pretty much won. And so people start telling stories about this time period when the West was still untamed, when it was still wild. You have the Wild West, the Old West. They're reminiscing about this time. And so you get the classic Western archetypes. You have your bandits and your cowboys, of course, driving cattle. You have your Lone Rangers, and you have, of course, the, not my words, but the savage Indian archetype, right? And you have your sheriffs and gunslingers in these crazy towns like Tombstone. And sort of the themes in these stories become about lawlessness and justice and betrayal, trying to civilize the land as if it, there weren't people already there, of course. And really the Western is wrapped up in this idea of manifest destiny, that it was the apparent destiny of the European settlers to push westward and move westward, and that America is theirs, and they're going to tame it and take it, and it is ours. And now, of course, these early Westerns that are still following these ideals, sort of like the romantic Westerns. You have like people like Louis L'Amour, and I'm not super familiar with this type of Western. I haven't read them. I've read a little bit of Louis L'Amour when I was a kid, but I don't remember it very well. But this idea of the Western became pretty popular throughout the early 20th century, and it starts to wane down, and then the revisionist Western comes in to take its place. And the revisionist Western starts to look at that time period in the 1800s when European settlers are expanding westward, pushing westward, through the accurate lens. Those older Westerns, the cowboy is the heroic figure. There's sort of this myth of the cowboy in the American West, and we were delivering justice, and we were making things right. And the revisionist Western takes that and flips it on its head and looks at the reality of what was going on, the colonization, the brutal violence of fighting these wars with the Native Americans and violently removing them from their land, killing them. It was a genocide. By the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, the Native American population in the United States had gone down to about 250,000 individuals, which is a massive drop from what it had been before Europeans arrived in America, but even a massive drop from what it had been by the end of the 1700s. And so the revisionist Westerns are coming about in the 1970s and 1980s, and they're taking this more accurate look at what was going on, and there's now themes of death and violence and colonialism. And this is sort of where Lonesome Dove finds its place. So Lonesome Dove is written by Larry McMurtry, who was born in Texas, and he predominantly wrote Westerns or contemporary literary fiction set in Texas. And Lonesome Dove was published in 1985. It is his magnum opus. It's by far Larry McMurtry's most famous work. So what Lonesome Dove is all about is there's this small town in Texas named Lonesome Dove, and I'm not going to hold this book up the entire time because it's heavy. There's a small town in Texas called Lonesome Dove. It's set during the mid to late 1870s. And there are two former Texas Rangers there who run a cattle ranch, essentially. It's the Hat Creek Cattle Company Livery Emporium. Hold on, I gotta check that. These former Texas Rangers that run the Hat Creek Cattle Company. And their names are Woodrow Call and Augustus McCrae. And they're both older. They're, I would imagine, probably in their 50s or 60s by the time this novel is taking place. And they had been some of the Texas Rangers that had gone westward and were fighting in Texas and the areas north of Texas and to the west, fighting the Native Americans, bringing civilization to that land. But now they run this Hat Creek Cattle Company, and they have a few people working for them. There's Joshua Dietz, who is one of their cattle hands, but he's a very skilled tracker. He was a former Texas Ranger and worked with them as well. P.I. Parker, same thing, a former Texas Ranger. And then you have Newt Dobbs. Newt Dobbs is a 17-year-old kid. And pretty much everyone in the book knows that Newt is Woodrow Call. They also call him Captain Call or just Call. Newt is Captain Call's son. But Captain Call will not admit that. Or won't acknowledge that, at least, and does not acknowledge that Newt is his son. And Newt doesn't know. And he says Newt is Call's son, and his mother was a prostitute who died when Newt was young, named Maggie, who Call had sort of a romantic affair with. But then Call, as McMurtry himself describes Call, is stoic. He's a leader, but he's very quiet. He's he's a stoic. He doesn't let things emotionally affect him. And so when he's engaged with this romantic affair with Maggie, his heart's not in it. The book describes him as not being good with women. It's funny. But so Call will not admit that Newt is his son. And Call is growing restless running this cattle ranch in Lonesome Dove. And then you have Augustus McCrae, who is Call's partner, also just called Gus McCrae. And Gus is pretty much the exact opposite of Call. He's a foil to Call's character. Gus is an Epicurean. He likes drinking, he likes women, he likes gambling. He's always poking fun at people, ribbing people. He tells jokes, he's clever and witty, but he's also lazy. He doesn't really like working. He's still very skilled and he's a competent fighter, but he doesn't like to work, really. And so this is where we find ourselves at the beginning of the novel with Call, this stoic character. You have Gus, who's Call's opposite. You have the former Texas Rangers, Joshua Dietz and P.I. Parker, and then Call's son that doesn't even know it, Newt. And they're all living in Lonesome Dove, and one day another character shows up named Jake Spoon, and Jake was another member of this Texas Ranger group with them. He's a bit younger, and Jake is a little bit like Gus in the sense that he likes whoring and he likes to gamble. And Jake, he'd been separated from them for about 10 years. He was traveling the country. And he was actually in Arkansas, in Fort Smith, Arkansas, gambling in this town, and he got drunk and he accidentally shot the town's mayor and dentist. And so he's on the run because the town's sheriff, who happens to be the mayor's brother, the sheriff's named July Johnson, is likely going to set off after Jake. And July is another main character. I won't get into his side of the story as much, but he is another main character. So Jake comes back to the town, comes back to Lonesome Dove. He'd been traveling all over America, and he had spent some time in Montana, which at this time, in the mid to late 1870s, there was not much settlement there at all. They have, I think it's Miles City there, which is small at this time. And so Jake gets there, and he tells them that Montana is basically a verdant paradise. The grass plains are lush and fresh. There have been no cattle grazing there. And Call gets it in his head. He gets this idea that he is going to start a cattle drive all the way from Texas to Montana, which is a very, very, very far distance. And Gus thinks he's crazy. Gus is like, this is ridiculous. But Call is dead set on this idea, so they start it up. They start rustling or stealing horses and cattle from across the Mexican border. Lonesome Dove is on the Mexican border. It's basically on the Rio Grande. So they start stealing these cattle from across the Mexican border. And eventually they work up a huge herd, thousands of cattle. And along with Dietz and P.I. and Jake, who reluctantly goes along and brings along a whore from the town named Lorena, who is the main female protagonist and is kind of a love interest for a couple different people within the story. But he brings along Lorena, and then they hire some cattle hands. They get some young kids. They get a cattle hand named Dish Boggett, who is very skilled. Yeah, that's about it. They start this cattle drive from Texas to Montana. And that's kind of the inciting incident of the novel. It is very much an adventure story. You have kind of the classic idea of a quest narrative. They are going to move these cattle from this small town in Texas all the way up to Montana and establish the first cattle ranch in Montana. And it's a huge journey. It's fraught with danger. There are bandits, there are river crossings and drownings, and there are snakes, there's bears, and then of course there are the Native Americans. And so what did I think of the book? I did love it. I thought it was a great novel. Mainly, not so much because of the plot or the themes, which I'll get into a little bit, I think, but mainly the characterization. Larry McMurtry wrote these characters in a way that they feel incredibly real. Most of the time when I read a book, I'll remember the main character, maybe a couple side characters, but I don't remember the entire cast of side characters. With Lonesome Dove, I can pretty much name them all, and I finished it about a week and a half ago. Maybe longer. He just puts so much life into these characters. The dialogue is so strong. It feels like real conversations that these people are having. And I read Larry McMurtry, he in an interview, he talked about how he grew up, around the campfire hearing these Western tales. And that's what this book feels like. For 800 pages, it just feels like people telling a story. And there's so much heart in it. There's so much soul to these characters. I'll just turn to a random page and probably find dialogue that feels incredibly strong and realistic. Dietz, have you ever spent much time wanting what you know you can't have? He asked, figuring to get the conversation off to a brisk start. Expect I've had a good life, Dietz said. Captain paid me a fair wage, ain't been sick but twice, and one time was when I got shot over by a river. That ain't an answer to the question I asked, Augustus said. Wanting takes too much time, Dietz said. I'd rather be working. Yes, but what would you have if you could have what you really want right now? Dietz trotted along for a bit before he answered. Be back on the river, he said. Hell, the Rio Grande ain't the only river, Augustus commented. So, it's sections like that. It just feels like real conversations between real people, not these fictional characters, but it's written so strongly that they do feel real. And that is one of the primary comments that people have about Lonesome Dove, is that all the characters feel incredibly real. So I did love the novel. It was great. It's not my favorite novel of all time. It's not even my favorite Western novel, but I did love it. Now, I do kind of want to talk about how death in this novel is treated, because, it's the 1870s, people are dying all the time, and they're on a dangerous journey. There's no modern medicine. They don't have a doctor with them. They're attacked by bandits. They have to cross deep rivers on just their horses that are moving very swiftly. There's storms. They get stuck in lightning and hail and sandstorms and ice storms. They're attacked by Native Americans at times. It's a dangerous world, and especially when you have thousands of cattle that you're trying to bring thousands of miles across the U.S., it's dangerous. And so death is a core part of the novel. It really is a linchpin in the world of Lonesome Dove. And it's not just the people that die. It's the animals. Cattle die during the journey. At times they talk about the herds of buffalo that once roamed North America and are now buffalo bison that once roamed North America and are now very greatly diminished. It's the death of culture. You get the sense that the Native American nations were once a proud people and have now been highly diminished by this manifest destiny of the European settlers. As for death of the characters, there are several characters who die. Sometimes it comes suddenly and they're just gone. They don't even get a last word. And sometimes the deaths are far more drawn out. Death in this world, and of course in the real world, is a normal part of life. Here we have Gus McCrae's take on death. So remember, Gus is an Epicurean. He's lazy. He is also very sensitive. He's really the heart of this novel. He's quite sensitive to the other characters. And this comes after the death of one character, and I won't spoil it, but Augustus and Newt, remember Newt, Call's son, are riding along, and Newt is reflecting on the death. And Newt, he's young. He hasn't encountered much death. Remember, Gus is a former Texas Ranger. He's seen plenty of people die, so he's used to it. And here we have Gus. It's all right, though, Augustus said. It's mostly bones we're riding over anyway. Why think of all the buffalo that have died on these plains? Buffalo and other critters, too. And the Indians have been here forever. Their bones are down there in the earth. I'm told that over in the old country, you can't dig 6 feet without uncovering skulls and leg bones and such. People have been living there since the beginning, and their bones have kind of filled up the ground. It's interesting to think about all the bones in the ground, but it's just fellow creatures. It's nothing to shy from. So death it is sad, but in this novel, I think it's treated as just something that happens, and that's true. That is reality. Death happens. It's sudden sometimes. Sometimes it's much slower, but it happens, and there's no way you can avoid it. Newt, here's what Newt thinks. It was such a startling thought that under him, beneath the long grass, were millions of bones, that Newt stopped feeling so strained. So, of course, Gus kind of helps Newt accept the fact of all these deaths. I don't know, I'm not sure I have too many other thoughts on that. Let me see. Check my notes. Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's about it. Death is treated in this novel as a part of life, which is true. The other thing I want to talk about is how Lonesome Dove subverts the Western genre, or if it subverts the Western genre. Remember, our revisionist Westerns are subverting the Western genre. They're taking these ideas of manifest destiny and westward expansion and civilizing the West and looking at that through a critical lens. Like, is that what actually happened? Is that what should have happened? Was that a good thing? Etc. And McMurtry actually had the idea to write this novel, write Lonesome Dove, as sort of a accurate portrayal of the American West. He wanted it through a revisionist Western lens. I don't think that term existed yet, but that was his idea behind the novel. He didn't want to write about heroic cowboys. He wanted to get away from that myth, because that is a myth. These were just people. And so in the preface to the 2000 edition, McMurtry said, "It's hard to go wrong if one writes at length about the Old West, still the phantom leg of the American psyche. I thought I had written about a harsh time and some pretty harsh people, but to the public at large, I'd produced something nearer to an idolization. Instead of a poor man's inferno," that's referencing Dante's Inferno, "instead of a poor man's inferno filled with violence, faithlessness, and betrayal, I had actually delivered a kind of Gone with the Wind of the West." So Larry McMurtry is reflecting on the fact that his book, despite the fact that he wanted to write about this harsh time and these harsh people, I think he was too good at making his characters likable, because most people don't read it that way. The characters in Lonesome Dove are fairly, many of them can be considered maybe not heroic, but good people. They generally do what is right. Not always, and I'm talking about the main characters. Not always. Of course, you have Cole refusing to acknowledge his son, Newt, and he never does throughout the novel. Newt really is, I mean, the town is called Lonesome Dove, but if you think about it, Newt is the Lonesome Dove. He's by himself. He's not accepted by even his own father. His mother is dead. Everyone knows that Newt is Cole's son, but no one will tell him. I lost my train of thought. Yeah, so I do think McMurtry failed at writing a revisionist Western. The characters are just too likable. The other part is he doesn't really address more of the nuances, the subtleties of the American West. You really get the sense that to McMurtry, or what McMurtry wrote, he wrote an adventure story, and that's fine. It doesn't have to be this critical analysis of the American West and of the Western. It doesn't have to do that. But it just seems like that was maybe what McMurtry intended, and that was not the result that was created. The characters, for the most part, don't even really acknowledge the fact that they are settlers, other than one line from Augustus towards the very end of the novel, last 100 pages, where he says, "Do you want me to do anything about them Indians?" Cole asked. "Which Indians?" Augustus asked, wondering what his friend could be talking about. Cole's cheeks looked drawn, as though he hadn't eaten for days, though he was eating even as he asked the question. "Those that shot the arrows into you," Cole said. "Oh no, Woodrow," Augustus said. "We won more than our share with the natives. They didn't invite us here, you know. We got no call to be vengeful. You start that and I'll spoil your appetite. So that's really the only acknowledgement in Lonesome Dove about the settler mindset and this westward expansion. And so the very last thing I wanted to do with this review, if I can call it a review, was to compare Lonesome Dove to another very famous Western novel, perhaps the most famous Western novel, that was published the exact same year in 1985. And that is, of course, Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, which I think does succeed at being a revisionist Western. If you have read Blood Meridian, of course, the main takeaway of it is how violent the novel is. And some people debate whether that violence in the novel is necessary. Some people say by the end of the novel, you get desensitized to all the violence in it. I didn't experience that. When I was reading Blood Meridian, and I've only read it once, I need to return to it, but when I was reading it, I never felt desensitized to the violence. I mean, it was visceral, but I think every time there's a violent scene, it's really like a gut punch, and you're thinking, oh my God, these things happened. If you don't know anything about Blood Meridian, it's about the Glanton gang, who are this group of scalpers in the West, mainly whites, who would go and they would scalp Native Americans and sometimes Mexicans. It started off as them fighting violent Native American groups and scalping them and returning their scalps to whoever was paying them, essentially so they could get a bounty. But then they even started scalping peaceful tribes and peaceful Mexicans. They would go south of the border as well. And Blood Meridian, I think, is set about maybe 25 or 30 years before Lonesome Dove. So it's even more set in this time period of the Wild West. And the Glanton gang were real people. It was a real group, and some of the characters in the book were real people. And I just think Blood Meridian really, it gets at something that Lonesome Dove isn't getting at. That this was not a nice time, that many of these people were not nice people. They had rich interior lives, of course, but a lot of them were very brutal. And you can even compare the epigraphs of the two novels. So here's the epigraph for Lonesome Dove. All America lies at the end of the wilderness road, and our past is not a dead past, but still lives in us. Our forefathers had civilization inside themselves, the wild outside. So you have that idea of the civilization within the Americans, and the wilderness that exists outside of them, the wilderness they need to conquer. Continuing, we live in the civilization they created, but within us the wilderness still lingers. But within us the wilderness still lingers. What they dreamed, we live, and what they lived, we dream. T.K. Whipple, Study Out the Land. So here you really get the idea of reminiscing on the American West. The Wild West, the Old West. We live in the civilization they created, but within us the wilderness still lingers. What they dreamed, so the original forefathers were dreaming of civilization. What they dreamed, we live. And what they lived, the wildness, the wilderness, the ruggedness, we dream. We dream of that time. We tell stories about that time. You compare that to the epigraphs of Blood Meridian, which I wrote down here in my journal. Blood Meridian has 3 epigraphs. Your ideas are terrifying and your hearts are faint. Your acts of pity and cruelty are absurd, committed with no calm, as if they are irresistible. Finally, you fear blood more and more, blood and time. And this is from the French poet and philosopher Paul Valéry. Second epigraph. It is not thought that the life of darkness is sunk in misery and lost as if in sorrowing. There is no sorrowing, for sorrow is a thing that is swallowed up in death, and death and dying are the very life of the darkness. This is from the German philosopher Jacob, or perhaps it's pronounced Jakob Boehme. And then the third epigraph, which is actually from a newspaper clipping that I assume McCarthy read in the process of writing Blood Meridian, and it just fits so perfectly. Clark, who led last year's expedition to the Afar region of northern Ethiopia, and UC Berkeley colleague Tim D. White also said that a re-examination of a 300,000-year-old fossil skull found in the same region earlier showed evidence of having been scalped. Yuma Daily Sun, June 13th, 1982. And that last one really gets at kind of, from what I remember and what I understand as, and this is a very shallow understanding of it, but the theme of Blood Meridian, that humanity is violent and warful and wrathful, and it has always been that way, and it still is. I mean, look at the world currently. And when you compare that to the epigraph in Lonesome Dove, McMurtry seems, oh my gosh, there's McMurtry and McCarthy. McMurtry seems far more optimistic about America and the American West than McCarthy is. So those are my thoughts. I mean, I loved Lonesome Dove. I thought it was an excellently written novel. The characters primarily are some of the most realistic characters I've ever read. They feel like real people to me. I enjoyed it. It was an adventure novel. It was this epic quest across America. I do not think it really met those standards of being a revisionist Western, which again it's fine. It doesn't have to be that, but that does kind of seem like what McMurtry intended, and he seems to agree that it didn't really hit that mark. I believe he wrote a couple prequel novels and a sequel novel that perhaps get closer to that. I'm not sure I'm interested in reading those. I may one day, not for a while. But yeah, that's Lonesome Dove. I would recommend it. I think it was a good book. I would recommend it. I'm currently reading Michael Crichton's The Lost World. I finished Jurassic Park last week. These are two of my former favorite novels of all time. I read them first when I was probably 11 years old, the 6th grade, in my first year of middle school. I loved them. And I still love them. They hold a very special place in my heart. I actually read those two novels before I watched the movie Jurassic Park and The Lost World. So they're really special to me. They were some of the first serious adult novels I ever read. Reading them now, I'm a little wow, this doesn't hold up to the pedestal I once held it on, or once put it on. But yeah, so I'm reading those now. They're quick reads, so I expect to have a video about them in the next 2 weeks. And then I don't know what's next. It might read some Pynchon, might read another DeLillo, might try some more Southern Gothic, Carson McCullers. We'll see. I suppose the world is my oyster. Thank you for watching. I hope y'all have a great day.